The housekeeper found the gardener's boy sitting on an upturned bucket behind the rose hedges on a cold October morning, and she did not need to ask what had happened. His name was George Alley. He was 14 years old and had been working at Ashworth Manor for exactly 3 weeks and 2 days. That morning, he had arrived before sunrise, pulled on his boots in the dark of the shed, and walked out to the east garden wall to begin the ivy trimming that had been assigned to him the day before. He had taken the best shears from the tool cabinet, the sharp ones with the oak handles, not the dull pair that the older gardeners sometimes left for the newer ones to find. He had worked slowly and with care, measuring the line with his eye, the way Mrs. Patton had shown him on his second day, pulling the ivy back to a clean, even margin. When he stepped away from the finished wall and looked at it, the feeling he had was the genuine kind, the quiet satisfaction of work done properly with your own 2 hands, without hurrying it, without cutting corners. Edmund Ashworth had walked past 10 minutes later. The Earl had stopped. He had looked at the wall. He had looked at George. He had not raised his voice. Edmund Ashworth never raised his voice, and the staff of Ashworth Manor had come to understand over time that this was not kindness but method, because a raised voice is something you can brace yourself against, while a voice that remains quiet and even and utterly certain as it tells you that you have failed gives you nothing at all to push back against. Edmund told George, in measured sentences that fell like water wearing stone, that the ivy had been cut at the wrong angle and would grow back unevenly within a fortnight, that the previous head gardener had maintained this wall at a consistent and acceptable standard for 11 consecutive years, without deviation, and that if George was not capable of matching that standard, then the question of his continued employment at the manor was one worth reviewing. Then Edmund turned, straightened his jacket, and walked back toward the house, without looking at the boy again. George had held himself together until he was around the corner and behind the rose hedges. Then he sat down on the bucket and put his face in his hands. Mrs. Patton found him 20 minutes later. She was a woman of 54, with gray hair pinned back, and a manner that was efficient without cruelty. She had been housekeeper at Ashworth Manor for 19 years, and had seen enough of what a house like this produced in its people to know that the first thing a person in distress needs is not advice or a lesson, but simply the presence of another human being who is not in a hurry. She sat on a garden step nearby and said nothing for a while. After some time, George lifted his head. "Was the ivy actually wrong?" he asked. Mrs. Patton looked at the wall across the garden. The ivy was trimmed evenly, cleanly, to a proper margin. "No," she said. "Then why did he say it was?" "Because that is what he does," she said. She said it the way you say a thing that is simply true about the world, like saying the road near the village floods in winter, or the kitchen boiler needs watching. He finds a problem with things that do not have one. The trick is to do the work well anyway. Not for his approval, because that is not a thing he gives. For yourself, because the work is worth doing right regardless. She stood and smoothed her dress. "Come in when you are ready. There is warm breakfast." She went back to the house. George sat a while longer. Then he followed. This is one way to understand Edmund Ashworth. There are more flattering versions, and those versions are not entirely wrong. He was 41 years old in the autumn of 1923, and he had spent every one of those years inside a version of reality that had been constructed for him before he was old enough to question it. He had been born into land, title, and a very clear understanding of the order of things. An understanding delivered not through formal instruction, but through the texture of daily life in a household like Ashworth Manor, through the schools he attended, and the men he knew, and the conversations he was included in, and the ones that stopped when the wrong person entered the room. All of it had confirmed, year after year, a single central idea, that the people at the top of the arrangement were there because they were, in some deep and genuine sense, better suited to be there, more capable, more aware, more entitled to make decisions that other people would then carry out. He was not, in fairness, incompetent. His capability was real, and it mattered to the shape of the story, because his certainty was not the certainty of a fool. He had taken over the Ashworth estate at 26 when his father died, and he had run it seriously and well. The farmland, which had produced modest yields under traditional management, had improved significantly under Edmund's direction. He had read about modern agricultural methods, had brought in outside consultants over the resistance of older tenants, and had pushed through drainage work on the lower fields that had been needed for 2 decades. The yields went up, The flood damage stopped. The estate accounts, which had been imprecise under his father, became models of clarity. He sat on 2 business boards, both of which ran better when he chaired the meetings, because he prepared thoroughly, kept to the point, and had a complete intolerance for time wasted on things that had already been decided. He was reliable, he was thorough, he kept his word. Among the men he dealt with professionally, he was considered sound. The problem was not his competence. The problem was what a long record of being right had built inside him, something so gradual and so total that he had long stopped being aware of it. When you are right about enough things for long enough, your certainty stops being a position you have reasoned your way to, and becomes the air you breathe. It becomes the invisible background of everything you see and everyone you look at. Edmund had been right about the drainage. He had been right about the contracts. He had been right, or at least not demonstrably wrong, about nearly everything within his world. And so the framework that told him who was worth attending to and who was not had never been seriously tested. He was not cruel in the deliberate sense. He did not enjoy the crying boy behind the rose hedges. He had simply not considered the boy in any way that would allow him to anticipate the result of what he said. The boy was staff. Staff were present, useful, and categorically distinct from the people whose responses Edmund considered worth modeling in advance. His French was a clean expression of all of this. It was a genuine skill, acquired at Eton, sharpened across 2 seasons in Paris as a young man, and real enough to sustain full business conversations and complex correspondence. This was a true accomplishment, and he knew it, and he wore it the way a man wears something he has honestly earned. But he had discovered, early in his adult life, that the language was also a tool of a different kind. In any room where others did not speak French, he could turn to another French speaker and say exactly what he thought, about a contract, about a guest, about a person sitting across the table, while his expression remained pleasant and his voice remained composed. It was the most elegant form of exclusion available to him. Those left outside it could not even be certain they were being excluded. They saw a pleasant face and heard sounds they did not understand, and they had no evidence with which to object. He had used this method for years, in drawing rooms and meeting halls and dining tables, and it had never once caused him a problem. Not because the people he spoke about had no feelings, but because no one had ever answered him back. He had no reason to expect that anyone ever would. His wife, Eleanor, was 17 years older than him, and had organized her life around him, with the patient precision of a woman who has decided to thrive inside a structure she cannot change. She was 68 years old that autumn, and still sharp and engaged in the world. She ran 3 charitable initiatives, managed a correspondence network that spanned 4 counties, and maintained a friendship with the wives of 2 members of Parliament that gave her a useful view of things Edmund never discussed at the dinner table. She handled her own schedule independently, managed her own staff without asking Edmund's approval, and appeared at dinner and at social occasions with the settled ease of a woman who has long since stopped needing the room to like her. She and Edmund were not unkind to each other. They had built, over 21 years, a partnership that was not warm in the way the word usually means, but that was functional and, in its own way, respectful. They did not interfere with each other's work. They did not make demands the other could not meet. They were 2 people of strong will and independent habits who happened to share a name and an address, and this arrangement held because neither of them asked it to be more than it was. Eleanor had hired Clara Whitmore without telling Edmund until after the arrangements were made. This was how she handled all decisions regarding her own staff. She had been looking for a new private secretary for 4 months. The previous one, Dorothy, had left to marry a solicitor and had given abundant notice and left everything in order, because that was the kind of woman Dorothy was, and Eleanor had been sorry to lose her. She had interviewed 7 candidates before Clara arrived. With each of the 7, she had felt some version of the same mild disappointment. Capable enough, well presented, able to manage correspondence and keep a schedule, but not one of them had the quality she was looking for, which she could not name precisely, but which had to do with the way a person listened, whether, when you were speaking, their attention was merely waiting to respond, or was actually engaged with what was being said. Clara Whitmore had been the 8th interview. She arrived at the appointed time in a dark coat that was clean and pressed but not new. She shook Eleanor's hand with a firm, unremarkable grip. She sat down and answered questions directly and without decoration. She had worked for 3 years at a county solicitor's office managing correspondence, and 2 years before that as a records clerk at a trading firm in London. She could take shorthand at a speed she quoted precisely. She typed at a rate she also quoted precisely. She described her organizational methods in concrete terms. She did not elaborate beyond what was asked. Then Eleanor described, toward the end of the interview, a particular piece of complex correspondence that involved 3 financial parties with overlapping interests that had to be addressed in a single letter without making any one party feel less considered than the others. She was not testing Clara specifically. She was describing the kind of work the position required. Clara listened to the full description without interrupting. Then she asked one question, a single question. It was not about the mechanics of the letter. It was about the underlying situation, the thing Eleanor had implied but not stated directly, the relational tension that was the real difficulty, and that all the correspondence difficulty was actually a symptom of. The question showed that Clara had understood not just the surface of what had been said, but the structure beneath it. Eleanor offered her the position before the afternoon was over. Edmund encountered Clara in the corridor 2 days later, asked briefly who she was, received brief answers, nodded, and moved on. He had not thought about her since, in any deliberate way. She was staff, Eleanor's staff. She filed the correspondence and managed the schedule, and was competent at the things competent secretaries are competent at. He had no curiosity about what she did in the evenings. He would not have found it interesting. But what Clara did in the evenings was, in fact, the most consequential thing happening in Ashworth Manor in the weeks before the Belgian meeting. She read. She had always read. Her father, Henry Whitmore, had been a linguist at Oxford, a man who lived primarily in his mind, and who had given his daughter, as his most lasting gift, a childhood spent across 4 countries, and the habit of treating language not as a wall, but as a door. You did not stand on one side of a language and wonder what was happening on the other. You learned the door. You walked through. By 12 she had been reading Voltaire in the original French. Italian had come during a year in Florence. German had arrived quickly. During the year her father was a visiting scholar in Hamburg, because by then she understood that languages, once you had 2 or 3 of them, began to illuminate one another. A grammatical structure in one helped you feel the shape of something in another. A family of words in French pointed toward a family in Italian that you could almost feel before you found it. Language was not a collection of separate boxes. It was one large thing, seen from different angles, and the more angles you knew, the more of the whole thing you could see. She had not mentioned any of this at Ashworth Manor. Her employer had not asked, and Clara had a deep and settled habit of not offering information about herself that had not been requested. This was not false modesty. It was something closer to economy, the habit of a woman who had spent her life being categorized by rooms that did not see her fully, and who had stopped expecting them to, and who had simply gotten on with being what she was, in the quiet and without advertisement. She had come across the Belgian correspondence file in her second week, while reorganizing Eleanor's filing system. It had been placed in the wrong drawer. She moved it to the correct location, and, in doing so, noticed the letters inside, and found them worth reading. She asked Eleanor if she might review the file in order to better manage any related correspondence. Eleanor said yes, of course, without thinking much of it. Clara read the file that same evening. She noticed several things that were not immediately obvious. Monsieur de Vries's formal letters were precise and professional, but in his most important points he slipped, sometimes for just a sentence or two, into a warmer and more colloquial French that had the quality of someone who had grown up speaking the language at a kitchen table rather than learning it in school. A different variety from the Parisian French Edmund had absorbed at Eton, not lower in quality, simply different in kind, and the kind of difference that signals, in a meeting room, whether the person across the table truly knows you or is working from a prepared version of you. One of the junior merchants, a man named Willem Baert, had submitted 3 covering notes written entirely in Dutch, apparently assuming someone would handle the translation. The youngest member of the delegation, Henri Marchal, had accidentally included a personal practice sheet with one of his letters, a handwritten page on which he had been writing out English phrases and their meanings in his own hand. His English was uncertain, and he was preparing for it, which told Clara he would struggle to follow fast English speech and would likely miss things that were said in passing. She made notes of all of this in her own notebook. She returned to the Belgian file 3 more times over the following 10 days, adding observations. She spent 2 evenings with a volume on Belgian trade history she found in the Manor Library. She told no one. She had not been asked. On the evening of the 10th of November, Edmund Ashworth sat in his leather chair in his study, reviewed his French vocabulary notes for the last time, decided he was ready, poured a glass of water, and turned off the lamp. In the small room off the corridor, Clara set her notebook on the desk beside her lamp, looked at the wall for a moment, and went to bed. She slept well. She almost always did. Outside the manor windows, the autumn night was quiet and cold, and somewhere down the dark road that led away through the fields, a train was moving south through the dark, carrying a delegation of Belgian merchants who did not yet know that the most important conversation of their visit would be with a woman whose name they had not been given. The doctor arrived at 8 o'clock in the morning, and by 8:30, the fact of it had moved through Ashworth Manor in the quiet, fast way that alarming things always move through houses, without announcement, without any one person deciding to spread it, simply by being real, and therefore impossible to contain. Lady Eleanor had collapsed at the breakfast table. She had not been obviously unwell the day before. She had been slightly pale at dinner, had eaten less than usual, and had gone to bed an hour earlier than her habit, but none of this had risen to the level of concern. Edmund had been preoccupied with the contract documents he intended to review that evening. Eleanor had said good night. He had said good night. She had gone upstairs. He had gone back to his study. That was all. In the morning she had come down as she always did, had taken her seat, had reached for the tea, and then she had gone very pale very suddenly, and Mrs. Patton, who was crossing the room at that exact moment with a serving dish, set the dish down fast enough, and was at Eleanor's side fast enough that Eleanor did not hit the floor when she lost consciousness. She was barely unconscious for more than 30 seconds, but the 30 seconds were sufficient to produce, in everyone who witnessed them, a fear that did not fully leave the room for the rest of the morning. Dr. Hartley arrived within the hour. He was a methodical man of 60 who had been the household physician for 12 years, and he examined Eleanor in her room with the thorough patience of a doctor who has learned not to rush conclusions. He came downstairs at 9:15 and found Edmund waiting in the study. He said that Lady Ashworth had experienced a fainting episode, consistent with an irregular heartbeat he had noted twice previously, but had not considered urgent. He now considered it worth addressing properly. He wanted her in bed for 2 full days, minimum. And he wanted genuine rest. Not correspondence from a pillow, not decisions made from a sickbed, for the week following. He said this clearly, and with the directness of a man who has delivered unwelcome medical instructions enough times to know that softening them too much only creates a second conversation later. Edmund listened. He asked 2 precise questions. He thanked the doctor and showed him out. He stood in the entrance hall after the door closed and thought, for perhaps 15 seconds, about Eleanor, with something that was genuine and not managed. Then his mind, which was a practical machine, moved to the next fact, which was that in under 2 hours, a delegation of Belgian merchants was going to arrive at this house for a meeting that had been 6 weeks in planning, and his wife, who was to have handled the social portion of the day, was in bed upstairs on doctor's orders. He went to find Mr. Greer. Frederick Greer was Edmund's solicitor of 8 years, a careful, reserved man of 45, who kept his opinions inside himself, with the professional discipline of someone who has learned that solicitors are most useful when their opinions arrive in writing after deliberate thought, not out loud in the middle of a developing situation. He had arrived at 9 o'clock as planned, was already in the small meeting room going through the contract documents when Edmund walked in with a faster step than his usual one and a face that was controlled but only barely. Edmund told him in under a minute. Eleanor was confined to bed. The Belgians were on a train from London that had departed before anyone knew she was unwell. The meeting had to proceed. Mr. Greer folded his hands on the documents in front of him. "We proceed as 2, he said. "You manage the negotiations and the French. I manage the contract documents." "There is the reception," Edmund said. "Eleanor manages the social side, the welcome, the luncheon arrangement, the ease of the room. Mrs. Patton can handle the luncheon." "Yes," a pause. "And we need someone in the room to keep the record. Notes, documentation. Eleanor normally manages that." Mr. Greer thought. "The new secretary. The one Lady Ashworth hired in September. Edmund looked at him. She has been managing the Belgian correspondence file, Mr. Greer said, with the care of a man choosing words. She knows the background. And I understand she takes shorthand. She manages letters, Edmund said. She is a secretary. Yes, said Mr. Greer, in a tone of such complete professional neutrality that it carried no argument and no agreement, only the smooth surface of a man who knows when to let silence do the work. But she has the file context, and she can sit at the end of the table and keep the record, and we do not have anyone else. Edmund was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who argued with practical solutions simply because he disliked them. He disliked this one. He recognized it as correct. The two things sat together uncomfortably, which was worse than simply rejecting it would have been. Send someone to tell her to be in the meeting room at 11:15, he said. She is to take notes and stay in the background, unless I specifically ask her something. He left the room. Mr. Greer returned to his documents. A young maid named Frances was already on her way to the East Wing with the message. Clara was at her desk when the knock came. She was working through a stack of letters Eleanor had left for drafting replies, and she was perhaps a third of the way through when Frances appeared at the open door, slightly short of breath, and told her that Lady Eleanor had been taken unwell and that the secretary was wanted in the meeting room by 11:15. Clara set down her pen. Is Lady Ashworth all right? The question came first, before anything about the meeting. Frances told her what she knew, which was enough to establish that Eleanor was being cared for and was in no immediate danger. Clara nodded and said thank you, and asked Frances to pass back that she would be ready. Frances left. Clara sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. She was not anxious. She had a clear-eyed relationship with anxiety, which was that she felt it when she had not prepared for something, and she had prepared for this. Not for Eleanor's illness specifically, no one could have prepared for that, but for the meeting itself. She had spent 10 evenings with the Belgian file, and with the trade history, and with her notes. She knew the contract terms. She knew the key points of disagreement that had been implied in the correspondence, but never stated directly. She knew the 3 members of the Belgian delegation by name, by role, and by the portrait that their letters had painted of them. She knew things about those men that no one else in that meeting room was likely to know. She opened her notebook to a fresh page. She wrote the date at the top, then listed the 4 contract points she considered most likely to generate discussion. Below that, she wrote 3 observations from her reading of the Belgian correspondence, the ones she considered most practically relevant. Then she closed the notebook, went to her small wardrobe, and changed into her gray dress, which she kept for occasions that required it. She checked her watch. It was 22 minutes past 10. She had more than enough time. At 20 minutes to 11, she was in the meeting room. She had arrived before Edmund or Mr. Greer, which gave her several minutes alone with the room, and she used them the way she used any time she had alone before something important. She looked at everything carefully and without hurrying. The meeting table was long and dark, with 8 chairs arranged around it. The head of the table was clearly designated for Edmund. The chair there was slightly different from the others, broader backed, placed on a small rug, facing the door. Mr. Greer's papers were already arranged to the right of the head position. The chairs on the left side of the table were presumably for the Belgians. At the far end, nearest the window, furthest from the door and from the head of the table, there was one remaining chair. Clara looked at it for a moment. Then she went and sat in it, placed her notebook in front of her, set her pen beside it, and folded her hands. The room itself was well prepared. The curtains were open on the east windows, and the morning light was clear and cold. Water and glasses were arranged on the sideboard. Someone had placed a small vase of late autumn flowers at the center of the table, late chrysanthemums, white and yellow, and Clara recognized this as Eleanor's arrangement, prepared before she had been taken ill, because Eleanor was the kind of woman who thought about making guests comfortable, even in the middle of managing a difficult preparation. Clara looked at the flowers for a moment, then she looked at the door. Edmund arrived at 11:15, exactly. He looked at Clara with an expression that gave her nothing. He moved to the head of the table. "You know what is needed," he said. "A full written record of all terms discussed and agreed," Clara said. "Any documents that require annotation as we proceed. Stay in the background," he said. "Do not contribute unless I ask you something directly." "Of course," she said. Mr. Greer arrived 2 minutes later, checked the arrangement of his papers, exchanged a word with Edmund in a low voice, and settled into his chair. At 11 minutes past 11, which was, for Belgians arriving on an English train that had run 4 minutes behind schedule, admirably prompt, Albert the butler opened the double doors and announced the delegation. There were 3 of them. Monsieur Henri de Vries came first. He was in his mid-60s, a solidly built man with a white mustache and the bearing of someone who had spent 4 decades in rooms exactly like this one and had stopped needing to perform anything for them. He was not showy. He did not enter the room with any flourish. He simply entered it and was immediately, obviously, the most present person in it. Not because he was large or loud, but because of a quality of solidity, the quality of a man who knows exactly what he is worth, and has long since stopped calculating whether the room agrees. He shook Edmund's hand with the brief, firm grip of a senior businessman, nodded at Mr. Greer, and glanced once down the length of the table at Clara. His glance was brief and entirely professional, the quick assessment of a man who has learned to read a room and does not waste the time. He nodded at her. She nodded back. Willem Baert came second. He was 40, broad-shouldered, with a reddish complexion and quiet, watchful eyes. He said very little in the exchange of greetings, shook hands with the correct degree of firmness, and took his seat with the economy of movement of a man who is not here for the social portion. He looked at the contract documents that Mr. Greer had placed on the left side of the table, and his attention went to them immediately. Henri Marchal came last. He was 28, lean, and slightly overcorrect in his bearing, in the way of a young man who is trying very hard to make the right impression, and is aware enough of his own effort to be made slightly awkward by it. He shook hands with a grip that was a fraction too firm, which Clara noted and understood. It was the grip of nervousness, not aggression. He sat down and straightened his papers, and then looked around the room, with eyes that were taking everything in. Edmund opened the meeting. He began in English, which was the stated language of the meeting's official record, and then moved smoothly into French for de Vries's benefit. The opening exchange was the practiced pleasantry of businessmen who have done this before. Thanks for traveling, compliments on the weather being better than expected, a brief and correctly calibrated reference to the estate and its history. Edmund managed this well. He was at his best in formal openings, because formal openings reward composure and preparation, and he had both in abundance. Clara opened her notebook and began writing. She wrote everything. Every term mentioned, every figure proposed, every point flagged or agreed or deferred. She wrote in her small, precise hand, and covered the pages without appearing to rush, and to everyone in the room, she looked exactly like what she had been described as, a note-taker, present, peripheral, unremarkable. She was also listening to something that no one else in the room was quite hearing. She was listening to the conversation, underneath the conversation, the one that was not being spoken. She heard the way de Vries shifted from formal to direct when he was about to make a point that genuinely mattered to him, the shift from the polished French of correspondence to the warmer French of the negotiating table. She caught the quiet murmur that passed between Willem and Henri in Dutch, twice in the first 40 minutes, and understood both exchanges without showing any sign that she had. She watched Henri's face when Edmund's English came quickly and idiomatically, and saw the small fixed expression of a man who is keeping up with perhaps 70% of what is being said, and is filling in the rest from context. She wrote all of this down in the private shorthand she had developed over years, a notation system that was entirely her own, and that looked, to anyone who glanced at it, simply like notes. The meeting was 40 minutes old, and already moving toward a difficulty that no one had yet named out loud. She could feel it coming the way you feel weather before it arrives. Not certain, but not in doubt. She kept writing. She kept her face still. She kept her pen moving, and waited for the moment when silence would become insufficient. That moment was closer than anyone in the room understood. The deal was about to collapse, and Edmund Ashworth had not yet realized it. He was, from a surface view of the table, in command. He sat at the head with his contract documents arranged in front of him, his French coming fluently, and his bearing entirely correct. He had moved through the volume commitments section and the pricing structure with the kind of measured authority that men like Edmund carry naturally, and in both sections, de Vries had engaged seriously, had asked sharp questions, and had reached agreements that were fair and clear. Mr. Greer had confirmed each point in the legal language of the contract and made his notes. The morning had moved. The shipping and delivery section was where it stopped moving. The problem was not legal. Mr. Greer had prepared the legal language correctly, and the English commercial convention it described was standard and defensible. The problem was that the phrase, delivery to port, as used in English commercial contracts of that period, meant delivery to a named English receiving port, with all responsibility for onward transport and customs handling resting with the buying party from that point. This was the standard Ashworth estate reading. Edmund had used the phrase in French without checking whether the French equivalent, which looked similar and sounded similar and came from the same commercial tradition in appearance, carried the identical meaning in Belgian practice. It did not. In Belgian commercial convention, especially among merchants working in the Walloon trading tradition that De Vries's firm operated within, delivery to port was more often understood to include a commitment to see goods into bonded storage at the entry point, with customs clearance costs allocated differently. The distinction was not enormous in casual reading. In a 7-year contract covering significant volumes of textile goods, it was worth tens of thousands of pounds. De Vries had heard the phrase and asked a clarifying question in French, carefully worded, the kind of question a senior merchant asks when he wants to understand exactly what is being offered, without yet committing to whether he accepts it. Edmund had answered the question as he understood it, which was correctly in the English sense and incorrectly in the Belgian one. De Vries had nodded. Not the nod of a man who has accepted a term, the nod of a man who has filed a concern for later. Willem Baert had caught it too. He had written something small and fast in his notebook in Dutch and said nothing. Clara had caught his Dutch. 3 short words, a question, something about the warehouse, and had written it in her own notation. Henri Marchal, who was responsible for the logistics side of the delegation's work, and who therefore had the most direct stake in shipping terms, had not fully followed the exchange, because it had moved at a speed that outran his French comprehension. He had caught the phrase and not the clarification. He had written a small question mark in the margin of his copy, and let it pass, because the meeting was moving and he did not yet have the language confidence to stop it. None of this was visible to Edmund. He had given his answer, and De Vries had nodded, and the meeting had moved on. He arrived at the quality standards section, and carried it through with his usual composure. By the time the morning session ended, and Edmund proposed a short break before luncheon, he was satisfied. The session had gone well, he believed. The main sections were resolved. The afternoon would close out the remaining points, and they would be through the contract body, before the light changed. He had no idea what was sitting under the surface of the table. The Belgians went to the side room that had been prepared for them. Mr. Greer followed, exchanging a word with De Vries about the luncheon arrangements. Edmund remained at the meeting table, making notes in the margin of his copy of the contract, preparing the points he intended to finalize in the afternoon. Clara remained at the far end with her notebook open. For a full minute, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. The morning light had shifted slightly, the sun moving west behind a thin layer of cloud. Then Edmund looked up, not toward Clara but toward the middle distance, the posture of a man collecting his thoughts. And he spoke in French. He spoke with the relaxed ease of a man who has used this habit in this way for many years, and has never once encountered a reason to be careful about it. He spoke as though the room were empty of comprehension other than his own. He said, in French, that the morning had been adequate, that De Vries was proving to be a careful type who took longer than necessary to reach conclusions he had probably already formed. He said he expected the afternoon to move more quickly now that the main framework was in place. And then, with the particular comfort of a man who has practiced this kind of aside for years without consequence, he said something else. He said he had to wonder what Eleanor had been thinking, sending her secretary into the meeting room, as though the woman were fit for the table. He said she had the look of someone from the back office of a provincial town, the kind of quiet, forgettable creature who copies letters all day and goes home to an unremarkable life, and who, if she has ever been in a room with stakes this high, has certainly never been part of what was happening in it. He said it at normal volume. He said it with no particular emphasis. He said it the way a man says something he has said many versions of many times, about many people, in rooms he assumed were empty of anyone who mattered. The room was not empty of anyone who mattered. Through the door that connected to the side room, which was open by approximately 4 inches, Monsieur de Vries had returned silently to retrieve a document he had left on the meeting table. He was standing in the gap of the open door. He heard every word. He stood quite still for a moment. He was a man of 63 years and considerable experience, and in those 63 years, he had sat across tables from many kinds of men, and he knew the type that Edmund Ashworth was with, the quick certainty of someone who has encountered it before, the man who speaks in a language he believes surrounds him with privacy, who says in that language what he would not say in the one everyone else can follow, and who has so completely arranged his life to confirm his own view of things that he cannot imagine the architecture failing. He looked at Clara. Clara was writing in her notebook. The line she was completing was finished, with the same precision as every other line she had written that morning. Her handwriting did not change. Her hand did not pause. Her face, which was turned at a slight angle toward her notebook, showed nothing at all. Not offense, not anger, not the small involuntary tightening around the eyes that most people cannot suppress when they have heard something that cuts them. Nothing. She was writing. De Vries came into the room quietly. He crossed to where he had left his document, picked it up. As he moved back toward the door, he passed the far end of the table. He paused for just a moment. He looked at Clara with the specific attention of a man who has just substantially revised his understanding of a situation. There was something in his expression, not pity, not outrage on her behalf, but something more considered than either of those. The look of a man who has understood something important and is deciding what to do with it. Clara did not look up. He went back through the door. Edmund had not noticed any of this. He was still looking at his contract notes. He straightened a page. He made a mark in the margin. He was comfortable. He was, as far as he could tell from inside his own understanding of the room, entirely in control of everything in it. He had been wrong about that since the morning began, and the wrongness was about to become irreversible. After luncheon, the delegation returned to the meeting table, and Edmund opened the afternoon session. He was brisk, purposeful. He intended to close out the shipping section quickly. It had seemed resolved in the morning. He saw no reason for it to occupy more than a few minutes in the afternoon, and then move to quality standards and penalties, and be through the body of the contract before the light shifted. He summarized the shipping terms position, as he had described it in the morning, in clear and confident French. De Vries listened without nodding. When Edmund finished, De Vries said, politely but with a deliberateness that had not been there in the morning session, that he wanted to return to the delivery point term from the morning discussion. He said he wanted to be certain there was no ambiguity between them. Edmund said there was no ambiguity. He repeated his explanation, this time with more precision. De Vries said he understood the English position, and that he had heard it as Edmund intended it, but that his own reading of the term was different, and that the difference was not small. He set out, with the calm of a man who has been waiting for the right moment, exactly what the Belgian Commercial Convention understood the term to mean, and what the financial implications of that difference were over 7 years of deliveries. Edmund said he had cross-referenced the term against the previous Ashworth contract, which had been used without difficulty. De Vries said, still politely, that the previous Ashworth contract had been with a London-based firm working under English convention, and that the current agreement was with a Belgian firm working under a different one, and that this was exactly the kind of detail that caused disputes in the second year of agreements that had seemed perfectly clear at signing. A silence settled over the table. It was not quite an impasse. It was something just before an impasse. The specific silence that falls when two parties have stated their positions clearly. Neither is wrong about their own understanding, and the gap between the two understandings is real and significant and has no obvious bridge. Mr. Greer was looking at his documents with the focused expression of a man calculating something very quickly. Henri had gone still in his chair and was watching De Vries and Edmund in the careful way of someone who is following a conversation at the limit of his comprehension and knows something important is happening. Willem had straightened almost imperceptibly in his chair, which Clara now understood was his version of acute attention. Edmund opened his mouth. He was going to repeat his position with greater authority, which was his instinct in a stalled situation, and it was the wrong instinct here, and it would have pushed the meeting across the line from difficult to broken. Clara set down her pen. She placed it on the table beside her notebook. The sound was small, the sound of a metal pen meeting a wood surface. Nothing dramatic, but it was the first movement she had made in hours. That was not the movement of a person taking notes, and in the particular quiet of that moment, it was loud enough. Every head at the table turned toward the far end. Every head except Edmund's, which was still turned toward De Vries, though it was on the edge of moving. Clara looked at De Vries across the length of the dark table. De Vries looked back. In the 3 seconds that followed, nothing was said. But in those 3 seconds, the entire geometry of the room shifted on its axis, moving toward a new center quietly, and without asking anyone's permission. And the people sitting in it felt it happen, and none of them would entirely forget the feeling. Then De Vries asked his question. He asked it in French, the warm, direct variety, the Walloon register, the French that does not dress itself up, and what he asked was whether the woman at the end of the table had understood what had been said in this room. Not what had been said in the meeting, what had been said in this room. The distinction was one that Clara caught immediately and completely. She understood that De Vries was asking about the recess, about the French that Edmund had spoken in what he believed was a private moment, about the words she had continued to write through, without giving any outward sign that she had understood a syllable. She understood that this question was being asked in front of Edmund, which meant it was being asked not only to her but to the room. That De Vries, having heard what Edmund said about her, and having watched her hear it in silence, and continue writing in silence, and give nothing away, was now creating a moment in which the truth of her could be demonstrated, and in which Edmund would have no way to look away from it. She understood all of this in the time it took De Vries to finish the sentence. The question fell into the room, and the room went entirely still. Edmund's head turned. He turned it in the slow and careful way of a man who has heard something unexpected and needs a moment before he reacts, and when he turned it, he had the expression of a man who is entirely comfortable with what he expects to find, which was a slightly flustered face, an uncertain murmur, a confirmation that the secretary was there only to keep the record and had not been following the discussion. He had seen this face many times on many people. He had seen it every time he tested the boundary of what was happening in a room and found the boundary holding. He watched Clara. Mr. Greer looked at the tablecloth. Henri sat forward slightly. Willem, who had not moved dramatically in the entire meeting, put down his pen. Clara looked at Monsieur de Vries. She set her pen down completely, placed her hands flat on the table, and answered him. She answered in French, not the studied, careful French of a person working from a textbook, not the Parisian French that Eton had given Edmund. She answered in the register that De Vries had used for his question, the warm, direct Walloon variety, the French of a kitchen table, the French that says without saying, I am speaking to you as a person, without the formal gloss, without the performance. She said that yes, she had understood everything said in this room. She thanked him for asking. She said it with the absolute composure of a woman who has always understood, and has been waiting, without impatience, without complaint, for the moment when someone would ask. The room did not gasp. Rooms do not gasp, but the quality of silence in it shifted, in a way that was as close to a physical thing as silence gets. A shift in the weight and texture of the air. The feeling of something that was arranged one way, suddenly being arranged another. Edmund's face moved. It moved through several things in quick succession. Surprise first. A genuine surprise. The surprise of a man who has been entirely certain of something and is suddenly not certain of it. And then something that was working very hard to become composure, but had not yet arrived there. His eyes did not leave Clara. Clara did not look at Edmund. She looked at De Vries, and she continued speaking in French, and what she said next was not about the morning's remark, because there was nothing to say about the morning's remark that needed saying. What she said was practical. She said she had been following the discussion of the shipping terms, and that the disagreement between the two positions was genuine, and not merely a matter of phrasing. She said that both parties were reading from their own commercial convention, and that both were correct within that convention, and that what the contract needed in this clause was not another argument about whose convention was right, but explicit language that removed the ambiguity, by stating exactly which convention applied to which phase of the delivery. She said she could suggest a clause revision if it would be helpful. She said all of this in French. She said it at the pace and register of someone who has been speaking this language long enough that the thinking and the speaking are the same thing, not two separate acts. De Vries stared at her for a moment. Then he looked at Edmund. Then he looked back at Clara. And his expression had changed into something that was not surprise exactly, because he had thought it possible she understood. He had thought it from the moment he watched her in the morning, from the particular quality of her stillness, the quality of a person containing something rather than simply being unengaged. but thinking something possible and having it confirmed are different things. And confirmation had its own effect even on a man who had prepared himself for it. He said, in French, "Please, go on." Clara looked across the table at Willem Bert. She spoke to him in Dutch. The sound of it made Willem blink. He was a man of considerable self-possession, and he blinked once, which in his economy of expression was the equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. He had been in this room for the better part of a day in which the working languages were French and English, and his Dutch had existed in the room only in the small murmured exchanges he had made with Henri, and in the notes he had written in his own hand, and had not expected anyone to read. He had been, in the most complete sense, half present, his body at the table, and a significant portion of his professional contribution inaccessible behind the language barrier. Clara addressed him in Dutch, and the barrier was not there. She told him she had noticed his note about the warehouse concern. She said that his concern was the correct one, and that what she was proposing in the clause revision would address it directly. She asked if he had other concerns about the shipping section that had not made it into the French discussion. Willem uncrossed his arms. He sat forward. He answered in Dutch, quickly and at length, more words than he had spoken since he sat down. A precise and practical list of 3 points about the delivery timeline that he had been waiting all morning for the right moment to raise, and had not found it, because the meeting had moved in French and English, and his ability to interrupt it confidently in either language was limited. He had the points written out in front of him. He had been waiting. Clara listened. She made 3 notes. She nodded. Then she turned to Henri Marchal. Henri had been watching her with an expression that had passed through surprise, and was now in a different country entirely. The expression of a young man whose map of a situation has just been replaced by a different and more accurate map, and who is still in the process of finding himself on the new one. He was 28. He was responsible for the logistics section of this contract. He had spent the entire day following approximately 3/4 of the English and somewhat more of the French, filling in the missing quarter with inference and hope, and he had been silently relieved, again and again, that no one had asked him a question he needed to answer quickly in either language, because his confidence in both, under pressure, was shaky. Clara spoke to him in German. She said, in easy and unhurried German, that she had heard the delivery timeline concerns from his colleague, and that those concerns related directly to the logistics appendix, which was his area. She asked whether the delivery windows in the contract's appendix matched what his firm had calculated based on current winter shipping schedules, or whether there was a number that needed revising. Henri opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the appendix in front of him. Then he looked at Clara with an expression of undisguised relief. The relief of a man who has been carrying a concern all day, with no clear way to deliver it, and who has been asked about it directly in the language of home. He told her, in German that came quickly and clearly, because he was no longer managing the language at the same time as the thought, that there was a discrepancy. The contract assumed a 15-day delivery window in the appendix, but his firm's calculations based on current port schedules from the Belgian coast ran 18 to 21 days in winter months. He had caught this in the morning, but had not been certain how to raise it clearly in French or English, and the meeting had moved on. He had it written on the page in front of him. He had been watching for the moment. "Good," Clara said, still in German. "That needs to be in the contract. I will note it now, and we will add a clause that reflects the actual winter window. Do you have the figures?" He did. He gave them to her, without hesitation. She opened her notebook and wrote. The room was silent. Not the silence of a meeting that has paused between speakers, not the silence of a difficult moment or an impasse. Something different, a silence that was itself a sound, the sound of a room full of people trying to process something they had not been prepared for, something that did not fit inside the categories they had arrived with, something that was entirely real and entirely outside the order of things they had expected when they sat down. Edmund Ashworth was sitting at the head of the table. His hands were resting on the contract documents in front of him. His face had found its way to something that looked like composure, if you did not look at it carefully enough. But if you looked carefully enough, you could see that the composure was the kind that a person assembles, rather than the kind that is simply there, assembled piece by piece, in the seconds after something has disrupted the ground beneath him. Mr. Greer was looking at his own reflection in the polished surface of the table. Henri Marchal had set his pen down entirely, and was looking at Clara, with the clear and transparent expression of a young man who has just been spoken to in his own language, in a room where he had felt stranded for most of the day, and who is simply, honestly, relieved. Willem Baert had not moved, but his hands were resting open on the table in a way that was different from how they had rested all morning, and if you knew Willem, which Clara was beginning to, you knew that open hands meant something had been released. And De Vries was looking at Clara the way a man looks at something he has suspected and has now confirmed, with a quality of attention that was focused and warm and entirely without condescension. Clara wrote her notes. She wrote 3 of them, one for each concern: the shipping clause revision for De Vries, the timeline points for Willem, the delivery window discrepancy for Henri. She wrote neatly and without hurrying. Then she looked up. "Shall I read those back?" she said, in English, the language of the meeting's official record, so everyone can confirm I have understood correctly. It was a practical question. She asked it with no note of performance, no gesture toward what had just happened. She asked it as the next useful thing. It was De Vries who answered. He said, in French, simply, "Yes, please." Clara looked down at her notebook and began to read. Her voice was clear and even, and moved through the 3 languages where needed: French for De Vries's concerns, Dutch for Willem's timeline points, German for Henri's appendix discrepancy, and English for the formal record. And the only sound in the room was the fire and the clock and her voice, working through everything with the calm precision of a person for whom this was not performance, and not triumph, and not anything other than doing correctly the thing she had come to the room to do. When she finished reading, she looked up. De Vries nodded once, slowly and with purpose. Willem said, in Dutch, "Yes, that is correct." Henri said, in German, "Yes, exactly, thank you." And the room, which had been still for the length of her reading, held its stillness for one more long moment before De Vries broke it in the way that only he could have broken it, in the way that only a man of 63 years, who has earned the right to say what he actually thinks, would have broken it. He laughed. It was not polite laughter. It was not the careful, managed kind that businessmen produce in meeting rooms to signal warmth without meaning it. It came from somewhere deeper, from the chest, from genuine delight, from the place in a man of that age where real things still land. It was the laughter of someone who has spent 60 years watching the world arrange itself, and who has just seen it do something unexpected, and honest, and good, and who is still capable of being moved by that. He looked at Edmund. He said, in French, the formal French now, measured, clear, the French that carries weight, that England appeared to have been keeping its most capable negotiator at the far end of the table, and that this was either a very sophisticated strategy or an extremely instructive accident. He said it with a smile that was amiable and direct, and that contained, for anyone paying attention, a very clear point. Edmund's face did something complicated. It moved through several positions in the space of a few seconds, and none of them quite achieved what they were attempting. Composure arrived eventually, but it arrived with a delay that was visible, the way something arrives after being assembled, rather than simply being there. His expression settled on something that was working hard to be authority, and was in fact, something smaller and more fragile than that. He said something in French about being glad the record was complete, and looked at his contract documents. Mr. Greer found something of great interest in the tablecloth. Clara had returned to her notebook. She was dating and heading the next section of notes, as though the preceding minutes had simply been a continuation of the meeting, which they were, and as though she had not been the center of something that no one in the room would forget, which she intended to act as though she had not been. Willem Baert reached across the table, refilled his water glass, and set the jug back. He glanced down the table at Clara. He said, in Dutch, that he thought the afternoon would go better now. Clara looked at him. "I expect so," she said, in Dutch. He nodded. That was all he said. But from Willem, who had said perhaps 40 words in the entire meeting before Clara's moment, this was a great deal. The meeting resumed. What happened in the following 2 hours was different from what had happened before, in almost every way that mattered, and the difference was not announced and not formalized, but was simply, immediately, real. He remained the Earl of Ashworth, the party with whose estate this contract was being made, but the working center of the meeting had moved, as quietly and as completely as the sun moves across a room over an afternoon, and everyone in the room could feel the warmth from its new position. De Vries directed his most substantive questions toward Clara. Not exclusively. He had the long-practiced social grace to include Edmund and Mr. Greer in the proper form of the meeting, and he did not do anything that could be described as rude or dismissive. But when a point needed resolving, when a term needed clarifying, when a concern needed to be translated from one party's understanding to another, his eyes moved down the table, and the answers came from there. The shipping clause revision was the first order of business. Clara suggested language in both French and English, a paragraph that stated explicitly which commercial convention governed each phase of the delivery, removing the ambiguity that had produced the morning's near impasse. She read it aloud in both languages, slowly enough that both sides of the table could follow. Mr. Greer reviewed it for legal sufficiency and confirmed it was sound. De Vries confirmed it was acceptable to his firm. Edmund confirmed it with a nod, his expression controlled. Then the timeline. Willem's 3 concerns about the delivery schedule were worked through one by one, with Clara moving between Dutch and French as needed, putting Willem's practical points into French for De Vries's confirmation, and into English for Mr. Greer's contract annotation, and making sure that the resulting agreed figures were ones that both sides had actually understood, rather than simply heard. At one point she asked Willem a follow-up question in Dutch, and he gave her a detailed answer, and she translated it for the room in the time it would have taken another person to form the translation in their head. No one commented on this. No one needed to. The appendix discrepancy that Henri had raised, the 15-day window versus the actual winter shipping schedules of 18 to 21 days, was addressed directly. Clara drafted a revised appendix clause longhand in her notebook, read it aloud in German for Henri's confirmation, and then in French and English for the table's record. Henri confirmed it, with a visible relief that made him look, for a moment, considerably younger than 28. He had been carrying that discrepancy all day, like a stone he did not know how to set down. And now it was in the document, in the right language, handled. Edmund watched all of this with a face that gave away as little as he could make it give away, which was, in his case, very little indeed. He was not a man who came apart easily, or showed his interior state without choosing to, and he did not choose to now. He contributed when it was appropriate for him to contribute. He confirmed terms that required the estate's agreement. He signed the documents Mr. Greer slid toward him. He responded to direct questions from De Vries in French that was technically correct and perfectly composed. He was doing everything right in the formal sense. The meeting, from the outside, would have looked like a meeting chaired by Edmund Ashworth at the head of his table. But from inside, from the position of anyone sitting in that room and paying attention, the shape of it was clear. The work was being done at the far end. By 3:30, the contract's main body was complete. The quality standards section and the penalty clauses remained, and these moved quickly, because both parties were now satisfied with the foundations, and satisfaction makes the final stages of a negotiation run like water downhill. The numbers were confirmed, the language was settled, the mutual acknowledgement that both sides had gotten a workable deal ran through the room, like warmth through a building when a fire is lit. At 10 minutes to 4, Edmund proposed they take a short recess before the final signature. De Vries agreed. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and looked down the length of the table to Clara. He said, in the Walloon French, that he hoped very much she would be available for any correspondence that arose from the agreement. He said this to her directly, with the tone of a man stating a professional preference, not asking a social question. Clara said she would ensure the correspondence was handled. She said it in French. He nodded. His expression, meeting hers, held something that did not need words. Some things are understood most completely when no one attempts to put them in a sentence, because sentences can be disputed, and what passes between two people in a shared understanding cannot be. He held her gaze for 2 seconds, then turned to follow his delegation to the side room. Edmund stood. Mr. Greer went out with the Belgians, talking about train schedules. The room was quiet again. Edmund remained at the head of the table. Clara remained at the far end, reviewing her notes to confirm the record was complete. The fire burned low. Outside the window, the November afternoon was thinning toward evening, the sky going from gray to a darker gray at the edges, the kind of light that tells you the day is nearly done and asks nothing of you except to notice it. Edmund said, in English, that the afternoon had gone well. Yes, Clara said, She did not look up from her notes. "The contract will be complete," he said. "Yes," she said. He said nothing else for a long time. She thought he might try some version of reframing, some way of placing the afternoon inside a story in which he remained the central figure, because this was the move that men of his type usually made when they found themselves standing somewhere other than where they had expected to stand. But he did not make it. He stood with his papers and looked at them, and was quiet, and the quiet was, she thought, the most honest thing he had offered all day. The signature ceremony began at 4 o'clock. The contract was drawn up in duplicate, with a French summary attached that Clara reviewed quickly and confirmed was accurate. Each party signed in the order that protocol required. Edmund signed for Ashworth. De Vries signed for the trading house, in a hand that was large and absolutely certain. Willem signed as witness, deliberately. Henri signed as witness, with the slight additional care of a young man who is aware he is signing an important document. Mr. Greer signed in his capacity. Albert the butler was called in as an additional witness, and signed with his practiced formality. At the bottom corner of the record of meeting, in the space designated for the note-keeper, Clara's initials appeared, C.W. They were small, written in the same hand as everything else in the document, precise, contained, unremarkable in size. They were, for anyone who read the record carefully and understood what the afternoon had contained, the most consequential mark on the page. After the signatures, De Vries produced a bottle of wine from a bag he had carried with him from Belgium, which was the kind of gesture that tells you something true about a man. He said it was from a vineyard near Namur, that he brought it to signings he expected to be satisfied with, and that he had brought it today in hope rather than certainty, and was glad the hope had proved justified. He poured the glasses himself. He carried the first glass to the far end of the table and placed it in front of Clara. He did this without comment, without ceremony. He simply walked to the end of the table and placed the glass in front of her and inclined his head slightly, the smallest of bows, the gesture of a man acknowledging a debt that does not need to be stated because it is already fully understood by both parties. Edmund received his glass third, after Mr. Greer. He held it with a hand that was entirely steady. He raised it when De Vries raised his. He toasted the agreement in the correct form, and his voice carried no tremor, and his expression was correct, and his composure was, to all outward appearances, intact. At 4:30, the delegation gathered their papers and their coats. Albert had the car waiting. De Vries shook hands at the door with Edmund, then with Mr. Greer. Then he crossed the entrance hall to Clara, who was standing slightly to one side in the correct position for a member of staff, and he shook her hand, and held it for a moment, and said, quietly, in the Walloon French, that he hoped he would see the name Whitmore on correspondence in the months ahead. She said she expected he would. He smiled. He went to the door. Willem shook her hand also, firmly, briefly, in the Dutch style, and said nothing, which with Willem was the equivalent of a speech. Henri stopped and said something in German, a full and genuine sentence, that the afternoon had been much better than he had expected, and that he was grateful. He said it with the directness of a young man who has made a decision to say the true thing rather than the polite one, and it landed as true things do. She thanked him for his care with the appendix figures. He nodded and went out. The car moved down the drive. Edmund stood in the open doorway of the manor and watched it go. He stood there longer than the car was visible, looking at the empty drive, at the trees that lined it, at the dark shape of the gatehouse at the far end. The evening air was cold. The last light had gone from the sky. He came back inside, and the door closed behind him. He stood in the entrance hall in the silence of a house that has finished a large day and is settling back into itself, and he looked at the corridor that led toward the meeting room, and at the corridor that led toward the east wing, where Eleanor was resting, and at the corridor that led past the small room where Clara's desk was. He straightened his jacket. He went upstairs to change for dinner. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say. Something had happened in that room today that was entirely real, and that he could feel at his back like a drop in temperature, like the moment when a season changes and you realize, standing outside, that the air is not the same air it was yesterday and will not go back. He had already decided what he would do after dinner. What he had not decided was what he intended to say when he did it. He had been a man of precise language all his life, and for the first time in a long time he found himself approaching a conversation for which he did not have the right words prepared, and did not know if the right words existed, and did not know yet whether that was something he was going to be able to admit to himself before he had to face her. He sent the message at 8 o'clock through Albert, who delivered it with his customary correctness. The Earl would be grateful for a word with Miss Whitmore in his study at 8:30, if she was available. Albert said, if she was available, because that was the form, not because there was any genuine uncertainty about whether she would be. She was an employee of the house, and the Earl's request was not, structurally speaking, a request. Clara was in her sitting room, rereading one of the afternoon's documents, when the knock came. She set the document down, told Albert she would be there, and after he had gone, she sat for a moment, with her hands folded in her lap, and thought about what was coming. She was not afraid. She had been in rooms like the one she was about to enter before, not always rooms exactly like it, with the particular smell of old leather and wood smoke, and the particular quality of authority that fills rooms where powerful men have spent a great deal of time feeling powerful. But she had been in the situation that the room contained. She had been the person who a more powerful person felt the need to address after something had occurred that the more powerful person had not managed correctly. She knew the shape of it. She knew the versions it came in, and she had decided long ago how she would be in those versions, which was honest, direct, and entirely uninterested in being reshaped by them. At 8:30, she knocked on the study door. He told her to come in. The study was large and dark-paneled, and smelled of things that had been there a long time. The desk was enormous and clear of everything, except a folder of papers centered precisely in the middle, and a glass of water to the right. Edmund was standing behind the desk, not sitting. Clara noticed this immediately, as she noticed everything immediately, and without appearing to. Standing is the position of a man who wants to be above the eye level of the person he is addressing, and Edmund was a man who made these choices by instinct rather than calculation. He did not invite her to sit. She stood on the near side of the desk, with her hands folded in front of her, and looked at him with a neutral and attentive expression, and waited. He began by telling her that she should have disclosed her language abilities when she was hired. Clara considered this honestly. I was not asked, she said. It is the kind of thing one volunteers, he said, when one possesses them. My previous positions were volunteered, she said. My shorthand speed was volunteered. My typing rate was volunteered. I answered every question I was asked completely. No one asked about languages. A short pause. Eleanor did not ask you? No. He looked at her for a moment. She should have asked. Perhaps, Clara said, you might raise it with her. This was delivered without any shade of sharpness. It was simply a practical observation, the kind she might have made in any other context, about any other administrative oversight. But it had the effect of moving the conversation onto ground that was factual and direct, rather than the ground Edmund had intended to occupy, and he looked at her for a moment, with an expression that was both assessing and briefly uncertain, and in that brief uncertainty, she saw something that was, in fact, the only thing of significance she observed in his face all evening. He shifted to the second version of what he had come here to say. He said that her conduct in the meeting had been irregular. He said that the role of a secretary in a meeting room was to manage the record and provide administrative support, not to participate in negotiations. He said that whatever her intentions had been, her contributions had bypassed the appropriate structure of the meeting, and that in future, she would need to understand and observe the proper boundaries of her role. Clara waited for him to finish. Then she said, "The contract was signed." He blinked, not dramatically, but enough. "Yes," he said. "With terms that reflect the actual positions of both parties," she said, "including the shipping clause, which carried an ambiguity that would have generated a legal dispute within the first delivery cycle, and the winter delivery window, which was wrong in the appendix by 3 to 6 days, and would have caused a penalty payment dispute in the first winter. Both are now in the contract correctly." "Those would have been resolved," Edmund said. Clara did not argue with this. She knew, and he knew, that it was not true in the form it had been stated, but she did not say so. She held the silence and let it say it for her, and the silence was more honest than anything either of them would have been comfortable saying out loud. Edmund moved the folder slightly on the desk and then moved it back, which was the movement of a man who needs something to do with his hands while he finds his next sentence. He said, then, in a voice that was lower and slightly less formal than the previous two things he had said, that she had made him look foolish in front of a business partner of significance. He said it with a different quality than the rest, more from the actual place of what was happening inside him, less from the version he had prepared to say. Clara heard the difference. She felt the weight of the moment and made a choice she had made before, in other rooms in other forms. She said nothing. Not nothing in the sense of having no answer. She had a clear answer, which was that a man who speaks about a woman in French in a room where she is sitting, having assumed she could not understand, and who is then answered in that same French, has not been made to look foolish by her. He has made himself look foolish by himself, and the credit for it belongs entirely to him. But she did not say this, because she had learned that the most complete answer in certain situations is silence, because silence gives the other person nothing to dispute, nothing to reframe, nothing to use as evidence that you are the problem rather than the truth. Silence is its own evidence. It requires nothing added. Edmund looked at her, and she looked at him, and he tried to read her expression, and found nothing readable. And this was perhaps the most disorienting experience of the entire disorienting day. He was a man who was very good at reading people. He had spent his life in rooms making assessments, who was nervous, who wanted something, who was hiding something, who could be managed in which direction. He was accurate at it, accurate enough that he had come to rely on it. In almost every face he looked at long enough, he found something he could use. A need for approval, a wish to please, a desire to avoid conflict, the small seams of insecurity that most people carry and that most people cannot fully conceal. He found none of these in Clara. He found a face that was present, attentive, and completely at ease. Not defiant. Defiance requires engagement with the other person's authority, a pushing against it, and she was not pushing against anything. She was simply not moved by him, not in the way he was accustomed to moving people, and the absence of it was the most profound thing in the room. She was not performing calm. She was not suppressing feeling. She was, as far as he could tell from every signal available to him, simply fine. Simply herself, simply standing in his study and looking at him, and waiting for whatever came next with the complete patience of a woman who has stood in rooms like this before and knows exactly who she is inside them, and knows that this room does not change it. He had no framework for her. He had frameworks for almost every kind of person he was likely to encounter, built from decades of being in rooms and assessing what was in them. But this particular kind of person, a person who was not performing anything, who was not afraid, who had nothing to prove and nothing to protect, and who simply was what she was, consistently and without effort, this kind he had not prepared for. He said, finally, that she could go. She said, "Thank you for your time." She said it without irony. She said it without warmth. She said it with the neutral courtesy she brought to every professional exchange, and the neutrality was so complete that it could not be attacked as rudeness, and could not be read as subservience, and was simply, exactly, what it sounded like. A woman concluding a professional conversation in the correct form. She turned and walked to the door. At the door she paused, as a person pauses when opening a door, not looking back, simply pausing. Then she went through it, and closed it behind her, with a quietness that was not pointed, but was also not careless. Edmund stood behind his enormous desk, and did not move for a long time. He stood there with his hands resting on the polished surface, and looked at the closed door, and then at the room, and then at nothing in particular, and what he was doing, though he was not a man given to examining himself in the way this required, was thinking about the day from the beginning, about the Belgian merchants arriving, about the morning session and the shipping terms, about the recess and the French he had spoken in a room he had believed was empty of comprehension except his own, about the afternoon and the three languages moving through the room in a voice that was not performing anything, that was not making a point, that was simply doing what needed doing because she was the one who could do it. About De Vries walking to the far end of the table with the first glass of wine. He thought about the phrase he had used in French. He said it again in his mind, exactly as he had said it, in the same words and the same register. He sat with the memory of saying it, and the knowledge of who had heard it, and the image of her face as she continued to write, not looking up, not giving anything away, just continuing to write, with the same precise hand, through every word of it. He sat down in his chair. The lamp on the desk was bright, and the room around it was dark, and the fire was low. He thought about George Alley crying behind the rose hedges, though he did not know he was thinking about that. He thought about the ivy that was correctly trimmed. He thought about what kind of man says the things he says, and whether that man is the man he had meant to become. He was 41 years old. He had spent all 41 years being certain of himself, in a way that had never seriously cost him anything. Today had cost him something. He could feel the cost, sitting there in the lamplit dark of his study, and what he could not yet do was name it, or measure it, or decide what to do with it. He turned off the lamp. He went upstairs. He did not sleep well. He would not have admitted this to anyone, but he lay in the dark for a long time, and the dark offered him nothing comfortable, and some part of him, the part that was honest beneath the architecture of certainty, understood that this was exactly what the dark was supposed to do. The letter from De Vries arrived on a Tuesday morning, 8 days after the contract was signed, and Eleanor read it alone before she told anyone it had come. It arrived with the Morning Post in a thick cream envelope with a Belgian postmark and the return address of the De Vries trading house set in a clean, professional typeface. Albert brought it to her room on a tray alongside her morning tea, and Eleanor, who was sitting up in bed considerably improved, restored almost entirely to herself, which meant irritated at being kept from her desk for a 5th consecutive day, looked at the Belgian postmark and set her tea down. She read it slowly. Her French was good, but not effortless, and De Vries had written at length in careful formal French that required her full attention. She went through it once and then, because there were 3 paragraphs in the middle that she wanted to be certain she had understood correctly, she went through it again. Monsieur De Vries had written to confirm that the signed contract was received, and that his firm was satisfied with the terms, and prepared to proceed on the agreed schedule. He had then spent 3 substantial paragraphs on the subject of Clara Whitmore. He described what had occurred in the meeting room on the afternoon of the 11th. He described it with the particular clarity of a man who has been in business for many years and has learned to separate what he witnessed from what he is inclined to feel about it. Precisely, and without embellishment, in the sequence it happened. He described the shipping clause problem and Clara's identification of it. He described the exchange in Dutch with his colleague about the timeline concerns. He described the German exchange with his youngest delegation member and the discovery of the appendix discrepancy and the resolution of both. He said that the contract as it stood contained corrections and additions that had not been present in the morning draft, and that these corrections and additions had, in his professional assessment, prevented at minimum 2 significant disputes that would have arisen within the first year of the agreement. He said that in his 60 years of commercial experience, he had encountered perhaps 3 or 4 people with the particular quality that Miss Whitmore possessed in that room, the quality of understanding, not just what was being said, but what was being meant, and what was being left unsaid, and that if she was content to spend her professional life managing private correspondence, England was not making good use of her. He said he hoped Eleanor would pass his regards to her directly. Eleanor set the letter down on the bedside table. She looked at the ceiling. She stayed like that for a while. She thought about the 6 weeks Clara had worked in this house. She thought about the Belgian correspondence file and the question Clara had asked permission to read it. She thought about the evening she had heard laughter coming from her own study and had gone to find Clara reading aloud from a badly written charity letter, with such perfect seriousness that Eleanor had laughed until her eyes watered. She thought about the interview in September, the single right question that had told her everything she needed to know. She thought about Eleanor's own marriage and the years she had spent managing herself carefully within it, and about what it meant to be a woman of considerable ability in a world that arranges things so that considerable ability must wait for permission to be seen. She had done a great deal of that waiting herself. She recognized it with an accuracy that came from the inside. She picked up the letter and read the 3 paragraphs about Clara a 3rd time. At 10:30, she asked Francis to send Clara to her room. Clara arrived within 5 minutes, knocked softly, entered at Eleanor's call, and stood near the door until Eleanor gestured her to the chair beside the bed. She sat. "You look better," Clara said. Not a pleasantry, a direct observation. "I feel better," Eleanor said. "Another day, and the doctor will let me downstairs, which I intend to hold him to." She looked at Clara steadily for a moment. "How is everything in the study?" In order. I've completed replies to the 8 letters you left for drafting. The charity correspondence is finished. There is one letter from the York solicitor that I put in the top folder. I thought you would want to handle it yourself, as it involves a decision. Good. Eleanor reached for the DeVries letter. She held it for a moment, looking at the envelope, and then held it out to Clara. This came this morning. Clara took it. She read it with the same quality of attention she brought to everything. Unhurried, nothing skipped, nothing glossed. Eleanor watched her read. She had become, in 6 weeks, quite skilled at watching Clara's face, not because it offered much, but because what it did offer, in small and carefully contained amounts, was always true. A slight adjustment around the eyes when something surprised her. A stillness that was different from her ordinary stillness when something moved her. She saw both of those now, briefly, and then Clara's expression returned to its usual surface, and she folded the letter along its folds and held it out. He is generous, Clara said. He is accurate, Eleanor said. A pause. Were you going to tell me what happened? Eleanor asked. Clara thought about this honestly. I did not know what was useful to tell, she said. The contract was signed correctly. The terms were sound. That seemed like the substance of the thing. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Edmund summoned you. Yes. How did that go? Clara was quiet for a moment. He said what he needed to say, she said. I listened. Eleanor received this. She had known Edmund for more than 20 years, and she understood what that short description contained without needing it unpacked. She said, I am sorry. She said it simply, directly, without theatrical weight. The apology of a woman who knows what happened and means what she says. Not for the meeting, that was entirely yours and entirely right. For the rest of it, it doesn't require an apology from you, Clara said. I know. I'm offering one anyway. Clara said nothing, which with Clara was often the form of acceptance she was most comfortable with. Eleanor reached for her tea. She was thinking several things in parallel, which was how she usually thought, several streams running at once, some of them visible and some of them running under the surface. She was thinking about DeVries's letter and where it might go. She was thinking about Dorothy Fairfax, an old friend in London who sat on the board of a firm involved in European trade work, and who was the kind of woman who read things and understood their implications quickly and knew what to do with that understanding. She was thinking about something else, a name she had heard mentioned twice in the past year, in the context of people who were looking for individuals with language abilities and contract experience for work that was, as the conversations had described it, adjacent to the Foreign Office's commercial interests. She said, I am going to send a copy of this letter to a friend in London. Her name is Dorothy Fairfax. You won't know her. She sits on the board of a firm that does European trade contract work. I want her to read it. Clara looked at her. You don't have to. I know. I want to. A pause. And I want to be clear that I am not doing it to manage what happens to you. I am doing it because the letter says true things, and I want true things to have somewhere to go. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said thank you, and she said it in the tone she reserved for things she meant. Go finish the morning correspondence, Eleanor said. Leave the York letter on the desk. The copy went with the afternoon post. Eleanor also spoke that afternoon with Lady Constance Fairfield, who came to sit with her for an hour. Constance was a woman who listened to things and understood them, and when Eleanor told her the broad shape of the meeting at Ashworth Manor, not all of it, just enough, Constance had listened without interrupting, and at the end had said that it was a remarkable story, and that she intended to mention it at lunch next week, with a woman she knew whose husband worked with a contract advisory firm in Mayfair. She meant it, conversationally. But she also had the lunch. Within 12 days, the account of what had happened in the meeting room at Ashworth Manor had moved through 2 social circles and 1 professional one, carried not as gossip. Gossip is soft and imprecise and improves the story and the retelling, but as the kind of thing that gets passed on when it is genuinely remarkable and specifically true. The kind of story with the particular texture of something that actually happened, strange in exactly the way real things are strange, without the smooth manufactured edges that invented stories carry. Mr. Greer had said nothing to anyone, because he managed information the way a well-built dam manages water, carefully and with no leaks. But he had, in conversation with a business colleague the week after the meeting, allowed himself a single observation. that the Ashworth estate had concluded a very good agreement with Belgian interests, and that the meeting had contained a moment he did not expect to forget. He had not said more. His colleague had been perceptive enough to ask enough questions to assemble a picture, and he had passed it on in his own version to his own circles. Edmund found out about the De Vries letter through Mr. Greer, who came to the manor the following Thursday for a meeting on a separate matter. At the end of the meeting, standing in the entrance hall with his hat in his hand, Mr. Greer mentioned that he had heard Monsieur De Vries had written to Lady Ashworth with warm comments about the meeting. Edmund said he was glad. Mr. Greer said the comments had apparently been very specific in their praise of the assistance provided by Miss Whitmore. Edmund said that was good to know. Mr. Greer said he had also received an inquiry from the London representative of the De Vries trading house, asking whether Miss Whitmore managed the estate's correspondence on a general basis, or specifically for Lady Ashworth. Edmund looked at him. "What did you say?" "I said I would inquire," Mr. Greer said. Edmund said he would think about it. Mr. Greer said of course, and went out. The first formal offer arrived for Clara 6 days later. It came in an envelope addressed directly to Miss C. Whitmore, care of Ashworth Manor, which was itself a statement, an envelope that had found her through channels that required someone who knew where she was to have pointed the way deliberately. It was from a city firm that handled European trade contract work, and it described itself as seeking someone with strong language abilities and experience in contract support, and the terms it offered were stated plainly, and were a third higher than her current salary. The second offer arrived 4 days after that. It came from a Paris-based trading house with a London office, and the language of the letter was slightly less specific about the day-to-day role, but considerably warmer about what it hoped to find in the right candidate. Clara read both letters twice, and put them in the top right drawer of her desk. Eleanor received word of both letters. They had been delivered to the manor addressed to Clara, and the household custom was that external correspondence for staff came through Eleanor first, and she held them for a day without speaking to anyone. On the morning she decided to act, she sent word to Edmund that she would like a word before dinner. He came to her sitting room at 6 o'clock. She was at her writing desk, fully recovered now and back in her own routine, and she offered him the chair across from her and told him she had something to show him. She handed him both letters. He read them with the careful, slow attention he gave to documents that required assessment rather than simply processing. Clara's name appeared in both, and in both it appeared in contexts that made it clear she was already being discussed, by people who had not known she existed 3 weeks ago, as someone whose abilities were specific and established and worth pursuing. He finished reading. He put both letters on the desk between them. He said nothing for a time. Eleanor watched him. She had watched Edmund Ashworth for 21 years, and she knew his silences. She knew the tight ones, the calculating ones, the dismissive ones. She knew the one he used when he was trying to be magnanimous and could not quite get there. And she knew this one, which was rarer, the silence of a man who is looking at a consequence and understanding, clearly, and without the comfortable cushion of denial, that the consequence is his own. "They have come quickly," he said. "Yes," she said. "De Vries." "Partly." "Not only." A pause. "She is good," he said. It was the first time he had said it directly, without frame or qualification, without the architecture of context around it to soften what it meant. Eleanor made no comment on the fact that he had said it, because drawing attention to it would only make him regret it. "I want to speak to her before she makes any decision," he said. Eleanor said, very quietly, "I think that would be a mistake." He looked at her. "She is going to receive better positions than this one. That has already started. It will continue. If you speak to her before she decides, you will say something that is not quite the right thing, because the right thing is very difficult to say, and requires a particular kind of honesty that I don't think you are ready to offer her, and it will make everything harder and will not change the outcome." He held this. "What would you do?" "In your place," Eleanor said, "I would let her make her choice in peace, and I would make sure that whatever she chose, she left this house knowing she was valued here." A pause. "In your place, not in mine, because in mine, I would write her a reference that made sure the world knew what I know, which is what I intend to do anyway." Edmund stood. He picked up the 2 letters, held them for a moment with a quality of attention that was not reading them, and set them back on the desk. "Give her the reference she deserves," he said. He went out. Eleanor looked at the two letters for a while after he had gone. The room was quiet, the fire was low. Outside the window, the November dark had arrived completely, and there was no light left in the sky at all. She opened her desk drawer, took out a sheet of her best writing paper, picked up her pen, and began. The acceptance letter was written before Clara went to sleep that night. Not because she had not thought carefully about it, she had, but because she was a person who thought best under forward motion, and the thinking had happened over the previous 48 hours, in the ordinary spaces of the day, while she was making tea, and walking between rooms, and finishing the evening correspondence, and lying in the dark before sleep. By the time she sat down with both offers in front of her on a quiet Tuesday morning, the thinking was complete, and what remained was simply the letter. She chose the London firm. The Paris position was interesting, and the salary was better, and the idea of more frequent travel to the continent had an appeal that she noted honestly. But the London firm was specific about what it was and what it needed, and Clara trusted specificity. The Paris letter was warm and open-ended in ways that could mean exceptional flexibility, or could mean they did not yet know exactly what they wanted. And Clara had learned over the course of her working life that openness in a job description is not always freedom. Sometimes it is simply the absence of a plan, and you end up being the plan they were looking for, without either side having agreed to it in advance. The London firm had described the role precisely. The languages required were listed, the responsibilities were listed, the working structure was described. She knew what she was walking into. That mattered. She also knew London. She knew its streets, and its pace, and its weather, and the way it smelled in November, which was not unpleasant if you had lived in it long enough to stop noticing it and start simply knowing it. A new city was learnable, but a known city was easier, and ease in the practical details of life left more attention for the work. She went to Eleanor's room that morning, with both letters in her hand, and told her she had made her decision. Eleanor asked her to sit. Clara sat. The London firm, Clara said. Eleanor nodded once. She had thought as much, for the same reasons Clara would have given if she had been asked to explain it. When would you start? They asked for as soon as reasonably possible. I thought I would offer 4 weeks' notice here. It is more than required, but the Belgian correspondence will need proper handover, and I want to leave the filing system organized for whoever comes next. 4 weeks is generous, Eleanor said. It seems proper, Clara said. Eleanor looked at her for a moment. I am going to write the reference today. I want to give it to you before you leave, rather than send it on afterward. A pause. I would like you to read it. Clara started to say that Eleanor did not have to show her. I want to, Eleanor said. Not for your approval, so you know what it says about you. I think you should know. Something moved in Clara's expression. Briefly, quietly, something small and careful, and then her face returned to its usual composure. Thank you, she said. She went to write the acceptance letter. Eleanor turned to her desk. It was not a short letter. Eleanor was precise with words, and did not waste them. But when a thing deserved length, she gave it length, and this letter deserved it. She wrote what she had observed in 6 weeks. The quality of Clara's attention, her organizational intelligence, her judgment in correspondence that required not just accuracy but understanding of the situation behind the words. She described the way Clara asked questions, specifically the habit of asking the one question that was the right one, rather than several questions that were approximately right. She described the Belgian meeting with care, in a paragraph that was neither dramatic nor diminished, that said exactly what had happened, and what it had meant, and what she had understood from it about the person who had made it happen. She wrote that Clara Whitmore was among the most capable individuals she had employed in 20 years of managing complex professional correspondence, and that whoever hired her next would quickly discover they had acquired something that exceeded their expectations. She read it back. She decided it was true and sufficient, and she folded it and sealed it. That evening she called Clara back to her room and held out the sealed envelope. For your reference file, she said, to be given at the new position on arrival, sealed. Clara looked at the envelope. You said you wanted me to read it. I changed my mind, Eleanor said. It will embarrass you, and I don't want your last memory of this house to be embarrassment. The corner of her mouth moved. It is very complimentary, perhaps too much so, which is why it should stay sealed. Clara looked at the envelope for another moment. Something in her face was doing that careful, contained thing again. The thing that meant something real was happening beneath it. She took the envelope and placed it in the inside pocket of her coat, which was hanging near the door, and pressed the pocket closed over it. She came back and said she was grateful, that she hoped Eleanor would be well, that she was sorry to be leaving. "Don't be sorry," Eleanor said. "I would be sorry if you stayed. There is a difference." She held Clara's gaze. "Write when you are settled. Write sooner if it is not what you expected." Clara said she would. The 4 weeks that followed had the quality of something winding down and something else beginning at the same time, the particular double texture of a final chapter that knows it is final and is still being fully lived. Clara organized Eleanor's study with the thoroughness of someone who intends the next person to walk in and find everything in logical and immediate order. She created a complete filing system, labeled and cross-referenced, that covered every ongoing matter and every relationship in Eleanor's correspondence network. She wrote a handover document of 14 pages that described, in plain language, every piece of work in progress and what it needed next. She reorganized the Belgian correspondence into its own folder with a clean summary sheet on top and the new contract copies in the correct annex. She answered every letter that came in during those 4 weeks and left each reply clearly marked for Eleanor's review before sending. She left nothing unfinished and nothing unclear. She also said goodbye to the house in the way she did most things, not abruptly, not with ceremony, but with a quality of attention that was her private form of acknowledgement. She learned the name of the new undergardener, who had come to work on the east garden wall after George had been moved to other duties. She sat in the kitchen one morning while the day was still quiet and had a cup of tea with Mrs. Patton, who gave her advice about London lodgings, the areas that were safe and reasonably priced, the streets to avoid, the market day on the Pimlico Road, in the brisk and practical way that was Mrs. Patton's version of genuine warmth, which Clara received as exactly that. George Alley came to find her the day before she left. He knocked on the open door of the study at the lunch hour with his cap in his hands and his face arranged in the particular formality of a young person who has rehearsed something. He told her he had heard she was leaving. He told her he wanted to say thank you. He did not specify what for, and she did not ask him to, because the what for was clear enough without saying the fact of her presence in the house during his difficult first weeks, the fact of being seen without being diminished by the seeing. He nodded after he had said it, and she thanked him for coming to say it, and told him the ivy was looking well and to keep at it in the same way. He went back to the garden. She returned to packing. Edmund she did not see for most of the final week. He was away in London for 3 days. She could not have said with certainty whether this was his ordinary schedule or a deliberate arrangement, and she found she had no investment in knowing which. When he returned, he was at the manor for 1 day before she left, and he passed the study door that final afternoon and stopped. She was at the desk, with the last of the handover materials in front of her. He said, "Miss Whitmore, I trust the London position is a good one." "I believe so," she said. He looked at the desk, at the organized folders, at the careful order of everything she had prepared. "The handover is thorough," he said. "I wanted to leave things properly arranged," she said. He nodded. He looked as though there was something further he intended to say. His mouth opened slightly, and then closed again. And whatever it was, he did not say it. He moved on down the corridor. That was all. On the last morning she came downstairs at 7 o'clock with her case. The house was already in its morning motion, fires being set, the kitchen beginning its preparations for the day. Mrs. Patton was in the corridor with a paper package that turned out to be sandwiches wrapped in brown paper for the journey, pressed into Clara's hands without ceremony and without making anything of it. Clara thanked her with more genuine warmth than she usually allowed to show, and Mrs. Patton accepted this with a nod that said she had noted it and considered it sufficient. Eleanor came down at 7:30, which she had not mentioned she would do. She appeared in the entrance hall in her morning dress with a cardigan and her reading glasses pushed up on her head, and she shook Clara's hand with the firm and brief grip she used for things that actually mattered to her. "Right," Eleanor said. "I will. Sooner rather than later." "I will," Clara said again. She held Eleanor's hand for a moment longer than the handshake required, and then let it go. Albert carried the case to the gate. Clara walked the drive in the cold morning air, the frost still unmelted on the grass, the sky a pale and clear gray above the line of the trees. The house behind her was going about its day. She could hear the kitchen, faint at this distance, and a door closing somewhere in the east wing. She did not look back. This was not hardness. It was simply that she was already thinking forward, which was where she had always lived most naturally, and the morning was clear and cold and specific, and the road ahead of her was a real road, and she knew where it was going. The train to London left at 23 minutes past 8. She had a compartment to herself for the first hour, and she sat beside the window and watched the English countryside move past in its winter arrangement. The fields pale and still, the hedgerows bare, the villages with their chimneys beginning to show the first smoke of the morning. She let herself sit with it all. The house, the desk in the small room off the corridor, the Belgian file read by lamplight 10 evenings running, the meeting room, the dark table, the chair at the far end, De Vries asking his question, and the room turning. The three languages, one following the other with no gap between them, simply the next useful thing. She was not triumphant. Triumph is the feeling of having beaten something, and she had not beaten anyone. She had answered a question. She had done what she was capable of doing, in the moment when it was possible to do it, and it had mattered, and now she was on a train to a city, where she would do more of it, in a larger place, with better tools and more room. What she felt was something quieter than triumph, and considerably more lasting. The feeling of a person who has always known what she is, who has carried that knowledge patiently, and without bitterness, through every room that did not see it, and who has finally been in a room where it became visible. Not because she had changed, because she had answered. The countryside moved past the window, and the train moved south, and London grew closer with every mile, and Clara Whitmore opened her notebook and began to write. By Wednesday of her first week at the firm, Clara's desk had been moved. She had arrived on Monday morning in December, and had been shown to a desk in the outer office by the firm's office manager, a precise and pleasant woman named Ruth, who gave her the key to her drawer and explained the filing system and told her to ask if she needed anything. Clara had thanked her, set her notebook on the desk, and begun reading the current correspondence file. By Tuesday afternoon, she had read the full file on 3 ongoing European contracts, had made notes on each, and had identified a problem in the German steel contract that had been stalling the file for 4 months. She had written 2 pages of notes on what she believed the problem was and how she thought it could be resolved, and she had placed the 2 pages in a folder and left it on the office manager's desk with a note asking whether it would be appropriate to discuss with the director. Alfred Caldwell read the 2 pages on Wednesday morning. He was 60 years old, had built Caldwell & Associates from a single-room correspondence service over 30 years, and had spent those 30 years watching people work with the accumulated attention of a man who has staked his livelihood on the quality of other people's judgment. He read Clara's 2 pages once, and then read them again. Then he came out of his office, and told the office manager to move Miss Whitmore's desk to the room beside his. He did not explain this at length. He was not a man who explained things at length when the action was clear. Clara arrived back from her lunch to find her materials already relocated. She sat down in the new room, looked at the arrangement, and got back to work. The German steel contract had been stalling because of a quality certification term that both parties were using correctly under 2 different versions of the same standard. A version that had been updated by the German Standards Authority 11 months earlier, which the Dusseldorf firm was using, and the previous version, which the client's legal representative was still referencing because no one had flagged the revision. Both sides had been reading the same word and meaning different things by it, and neither had understood why the other was not agreeing, and the correspondence had been circling the same point for 4 months without closing. Caldwell reviewed it, added his formal signature, and sent it. The contract closed 11 days later. This was how things went at Caldwell & Associates, and how they continued to go as December turned to January, and January to spring. Clara sat at her desk, and read, and thought, and noted, and wrote, and when she had something worth saying, she brought it to Caldwell's room on 2 pages or 3, and the pages were always sufficient, and the problems they addressed were resolved. One by one, and then in clusters as the months accumulated, and then, as a matter of expectation, the people on the other end of the firm's contracts began to specify that they wanted correspondence to come through Miss Whitmore's desk. They did not always know why they wanted this. They simply knew that when it did, the things they needed understood were understood, and the things that needed resolving were resolved, and the exchange moved. By the end of 1924, she was managing 5 ongoing European contracts simultaneously. By the spring of 1926, she was drafting negotiation strategy documents for the firm's largest clients, papers that laid out the approach and the language and the likely positions of the other party, and that were, in the assessment of everyone who used them, accurate. One client had asked Caldwell, with a humor that was only partly humor, whether Miss Whitmore had a contact inside the other side's firm. He had said no. She simply read everything that was available and listened with more attention than most people. And the client had said that in his experience those two things, done together and consistently, were rarer than they should be. In 1927, she began learning Italian. This was her 5th language, French, German, Dutch being the first 3, with a Walloon variant of French that she counted separately for her own bookkeeping, bringing her to 4 before Italian. She had been corresponding on behalf of a client with a Milanese textile firm, and had found that her written Italian, which she had assembled from French and Latin roots and a dictionary, was sufficient for formal letters, but was missing things in shorter and faster exchanges. The warmth that lives between the lines of a language you carry in your body, rather than one you construct from parts. She found an Italian opera singer who lived 2 streets away from her rooms in Bloomsbury, and who gave conversational lessons on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and she went to these for 8 months, with the same patient consistency she brought to everything. And at the end of 8 months her Italian was good, and by 1929 it was excellent, and she read Dante in the original that winter, and found it exactly as extraordinary as she had always believed it would be, which was a rare satisfaction. The rare satisfaction of a thing that lives up to its long anticipation. She moved to a better flat in 1928. It had a sitting room with enough shelf space for all the books, and a window that looked over a square with old plane trees in it. She had a housekeeper named Mrs. Webb who came twice a week and who treated Clara's books with a respectful indifference that Clara found entirely comfortable, and who had once, when Clara came home from a week in Brussels and was so tired she could not think clearly enough to make supper, simply produced a pot of soup and sat with her at the kitchen table until she had eaten enough. She had friends. Dorothy, from her years at the county solicitor's office, was in Edinburgh now, with her husband, and wrote long letters, full of domestic comedy, that arrived reliably every 3rd week. A woman named Grace, who worked at a publishing house in Covent Garden, and who knew what to do with a London evening, in a way that Clara, in her first year, was still learning. Caldwell himself, who had the quality of becoming a friend so gradually, and with so little ceremony, that she realized one day they had been talking about things that were entirely unrelated to work for quite a long time, and that this was simply how it was. She wrote to Eleanor regularly, and Eleanor wrote back, direct, organized, clear letters that had exactly Eleanor's voice on the page, letters that covered current affairs and charitable work and the estate, and occasionally something more considered. Eleanor mentioned Edmund rarely and briefly when she did. He was well. The estate was producing well. He had stepped back from one of his boards. He had, Eleanor mentioned once, in passing, taken up the garden in a more personal way, which had surprised the gardening staff. Once, perhaps 3 years after Clara had left the manor, Eleanor mentioned in a postscript that Edmund had asked after her when her name came up. She did not say in what context her name had come up, and Clara did not ask. She folded the letter into the drawer, where she kept Eleanor's letters, all of them, in the order they had arrived, and she thought about it for a few minutes, while she walked to work in the rain. Then she thought about the contract terminology question she needed to settle before her 10 o'clock meeting, and the rain came heavier, and London smelled the way London smells in the rain, and she walked on. The Trade Journal article appeared in 1938, in a publication that covered European commercial relations. It was an article about the development of cross-border contract practice in Britain since the Great War, and it mentioned Clara Whitmore in 2 sentences, describing her as coming from obscure origins and having built a career of unusual distinction in European trade work. The sentences were accurate in content if not rich in language. Clara read the article over her morning coffee and found obscure origins mildly amusing. She was from Oxford, which is not particularly obscure, but had not been born to money or title, and in the publication's vocabulary, those amounted to the same thing. She kept the article. She put it in a folder on the shelf behind her desk, between a Belgian contract summary from 1924 and a letter from a client in Milan. Monsieur de Vries had retired from active management of the trading house in 1929, at 71, and had gone to live at his house in Liège, where he had a garden and a study, and the particular contentment of a man who has worked long enough and hard enough to earn a rest that he actually takes. 2 years after his retirement, his successor at the firm had sent him a selection of documents from the archives that he thought de Vries might want to have personally. The signed Ashworth contract was among them. De Vries had looked at it for a long time. He had looked at the shipping clause revision, which stood in the document in clean and unambiguous language, and the delivery window in the appendix with the correct winter figures, and the record of meeting in the back of the folder with its notes in 3 languages where needed, and its small initials at the bottom corner. Then he had taken the cover letter from the week after the signing, the one Clara had drafted and signed as the meeting's secretary, setting out the first year's delivery schedule, and had it framed. He put it on the wall of his study beside his desk in Liège, where it stayed for the rest of his life, alongside the other documents he had decided were worth framing, which were not many. When his daughter asked about it, he told the story. He had told it before, to various people over the years, and he told it now, the way he always did, with precision and without embellishment, in the sequence it happened: the morning session and the shipping terms, the recess and the sound of Edmund's French in a room he had believed was private, the woman at the end of the table who continued to write without lifting her head, the afternoon, and the question he had decided to ask. His daughter asked how he had known, in that specific moment, that the question was worth asking. He said, "The only way you know a thing like that is by watching carefully." He said he had been watching her since the morning, the quality of her stillness, the pace of her writing, the way her attention moved in the room, even when her face was turned toward the page. He said there is a kind of stillness in a person who is containing something, and a different kind in a person who is simply not engaged, and the two kinds do not look alike to someone who has been watching people for 60 years. His daughter asked what the difference was, exactly. De Vries thought about it for a moment. He said, "The woman who is not engaged has a kind of emptiness behind her eyes, the absence of investment. The woman who is containing something has the opposite, the presence of investment, held very still, like water held behind a dam, rather than water that is simply not there." He said she was the most complete version of a thing he had been looking for in business associates for 60 years, and had rarely found. She had been the only person in that room who was listening, not listening in the passive sense, not simply receiving what was said. That is what all the others were doing, in various degrees. She was listening the way a navigator listens to weather, or a doctor listens to a patient, with her whole capacity, not the part that remains available after the rest is occupied with preparing the next thing to say. He said this quality could not be given to a person who did not have it. It could be practiced in small ways, made more consistent in a person who already possessed it, but the root of it was either there or it was not. And he said, and this was the part he said, with the particular slowness of a man who has thought about something for a long time and is now choosing words with care, that the extraordinary thing about what had happened in that meeting room was not the languages. The languages were the visible evidence. The actual thing, the thing that mattered, was the listening. The languages were simply what the listening had been gathering for a lifetime, and what it delivered, on that particular November afternoon, when the room finally asked. Ashworth Manor continued. It continued the way large and old things continue, with the momentum of their own history, outlasting the particular people who move through them. The farmland did well under Edmund's management, and then under the estate manager's management, and then under the next generations. Edmund stepped back from his active role in the early 1930s, and spent his later years in the garden, and at his club, and in the quieter version of a life that had once been louder. He died in the spring of 1951. The obituary was correct, and not long, and mentioned the farmland improvements, and the board service, and the 400-year tenure of the estate. It did not mention the November meeting. It did not mention French. Eleanor outlived him by 9 years. She spent those 9 years in correspondence and charitable work and the company of people she found genuinely engaging, which was a good way to spend 9 years, and she was well into her 80s when her handwriting became too difficult for letters, and a niece came to take dictation, and the letters that arrived for Clara during that final period were in the niece's hand, but entirely in Eleanor's voice, which Clara had known for 30 years by then, and could have identified on a single sentence. The Belgian contract remained in the Ashworth Estate archive. It was in the correct folder for that commercial year, properly dated and cross-referenced, with the amendment pages in order and the record of meeting in the back. It was not remarkable in the archive. It was simply there, as all contracts are simply there, evidence of something agreed and honored and completed. At the bottom of the record of meeting was a row of initials: De Vries for the trading house, Edmund for Ashworth, Greer and Albert as witnesses, and at the very end, in the space designated for the note-keeper, 2 small letters in a precise and clear hand: C.W. They were small. They occupied perhaps half a centimeter of the page. In the scale of the document, they were entirely minor. They were also, for anyone who read the document carefully and understood what the afternoon of the 11th of November 1923 had contained, the initials of the person without whom the document would not have been what it was. Clara Whitmore retired in 1958, at 62 years old, after 35 years at Caldwell and Associates, in various forms. Alfred Caldwell had died in 1949, and the firm had passed to his son Charles, who had kept Clara and built around her, and found the arrangement to be one of the best decisions his inheritance had made. She came to the office 3 days a week in her final years, and was consulted on the complex files and the difficult negotiations, and the younger people at the firm learned, those who paid attention, that bringing a problem to Miss Whitmore was not the same as bringing it to anyone else in the building. The retirement gathering was at the firm on a Thursday afternoon. 12 people came, at her request. She had asked for it to be small, and it was. Charles Caldwell spoke, and the senior contract partner spoke, and then someone who had been a junior at the firm for 15 years spoke with an honesty that surprised the room. He said that what he had learned from Miss Whitmore, in 15 years of watching her work, was not any particular skill or method or technique. He said what he had learned was that listening, actual listening, full listening, the kind that doesn't portion off half its capacity for the next sentence, was not a social courtesy. It was a professional instrument. He said he had watched her walk into meetings where everyone else in the room was managing themselves, and she was simply present, and that the difference in outcome was consistent enough to teach. Clara received this with the contained composure she had always brought to things that moved her and that she preferred not to show. She said the work had been interesting. She said this was the highest compliment she had in her vocabulary, and that she was glad to have given the years of her life to something that deserved it. She walked home that evening along the streets she had walked for 35 years, along the square with the plane trees that were taller and more certain of themselves than they had been in 1923. She walked with her hands in the pockets of her good coat and looked at the city that had been hers for the length of an adult life. She thought about De Vries's study in Liège and the framed letter on the wall. She thought about Eleanor's handwriting in the long sequence of letters in the drawer. She thought about the train from Ashworth Manor in December, and the pale winter countryside moving past the window, and the notebook open on her knee. She thought about the meeting room, the dark table, the chair at the far end nearest the window, the sound of a pen set down. She had come a long way from the end of that table. She had come exactly as far as she had always understood she would come, if the world ever paused long enough in its arrangements to ask the question. She turned the corner into her street and walked toward the lights of her building, and the plane trees behind her went on doing what plane trees do, which is stand and be patient and outlast the seasons, and the city went on being the city, and the evening came fully down around all of it. She had been the only one who was listening. That was the whole of it, and it was enough, and it had always been enough.